Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from around the world. My name is Sarah Fedirko. I am the Associate Director of Alumni and Community Engagement at the University of Regina. But most importantly, I am a very proud alumni of the university myself. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation with Jessie Thistle, the author of our current book club titled From the Ashes, My Story of Being Métis, Homeless, and Finding My Way. We are so very pleased that Jessie could be with us today. We have great representation from coast to coast to coast with alumni joining us. I see in the chat from BC all the way to New Brunswick, up north to Nunavut, and we even have an alum joining us from Australia today. So welcome to everyone. I would also like to acknowledge and welcome Lisa Mitchell and Glennis Sylvester from the University of Regina's executive team to the call today. So welcome to you as well. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are gathered virtually on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, and Nakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis. Respecting the traditional custom of the Indigenous people in Treaty 4 territory, we will also be presenting Jessie with a gift of tobacco to thank him for joining us today. If at any time during our event you need help with this experience or have any questions at all, please feel free to use the chat button on the bottom of your screen and our team will be ready to help you. The audience question and answer portion of the event will begin in approximately a half an hour, so please feel free to start asking your questions in the chat at any time, and I will grab those questions from there and make sure that we get as many as we can to Jessie with the time we have allotted. So before we proceed to our formal program, I have just one bit of housekeeping I'd like to do, and we're going to run a really quick poll with the question, have you attended a University of Regina alumni event online or in person before? So please take a second and click yes or no, submit your answer, and then we can get started with the formal program. I'll give you one more second here. Okay, thank you very much. So to kick off the very first virtual fireside chat of the University of Regina Alumni and Community Engagement team with our book club, and on behalf of our team, I'd like to welcome our moderator today, Paula Dagley. Originally from Nova Scotia, Paula is the University Librarian at First Nations University of Canada. And of course, joining us today to talk about his memoir, From the Ashes, is Assistant Professor Jessie Thistle. He is a PhD student and alum of York University. I am so thrilled to have you both on the call today and welcome you both.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you.
I am so very pleased to be moderating this fireside chat and honored to be introducing our guest today, especially as this is National Addiction Awareness Week. So I have my notes here. Jessie has many accolades and I need to make sure that I get them correct. So author Jessie Thistle is Métis Cree from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. He is an assistant professor in Métis studies at York University in Toronto and a PhD candidate in history. He won a Governor General's Academic Medal in 2016, is a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Scholar and a Vanier Scholar, and his award-winning memoir, From the Ashes, is a #1 national bestseller, a CBC Canada Reads finalist, and an Indigo Best Book of 2019. The memoir we will discuss today details how his issues with abandonment and addiction led to homelessness, incarceration, and his eventual redemption through higher education. It is an exploration into the impact of prejudice and racism, revealing a story about hope, resilience, and a man who refused to give up. Welcome, Jessie.
Thank you. Nice to be here with you, Paula.
I have to tell you, I actually have a personal story about you. I heard about you before your book was even published. One of my good friends is Bruce Walsh, who used to be the director of the U of R Press. And he also was a Trudeau Scholar mentee. And he met you in St. John's, Newfoundland, and he came back, we were having brunch, and he told me all about your story. And I said, oh my gosh, Bruce, you have to publish this. This is going to be a bestseller. do I know my stuff or what?
You do.
And he said, I'm so sorry. He said, he already has a contract with Simon and Schuster. So I actually would like to know, especially where this book is so personal, how has the publishing process been for you, especially to publish something so incredibly personal?
Well, it's been a great. I worked with a good editor at Simon and Schuster named Laurie Grassi. They got her from Chatelaine. She was there for many years and then moved over to Simon and Schuster. And it was kind of like had a personal relationship with just Laurie, me and her working through building out the book and creating the meta narrative that the book became. It was a lovely process. It's been a little bananas since it came out. I got to tell you, we're in like the 20th or 21st printing already, which for a new book is pretty good, I hear. And so, yeah, it's been a runaway hit, and we're just trying to stay above water at this point. There's a lot of like intense pressure that comes from having a really successful book. So,
are you surprised that it is so successful and that it's resonated with so many people?
yeah, for sure. Like, it's about a guy who succumbs to addiction because of trauma and ends up homeless, and then, finds love and gets off the street. And so to me, that's, it doesn't sound like high adventure, or something like, more romantic. It's just like, this is the experience of a lot of different people. So I thought it might have a little success, but it's been on the bestseller now this week, 66 weeks straight. So that's crazy. Like, yeah.
What has your response been like from the Indigenous communities?
Most love it. Most that I've talked to love it. I get like emails from people saying I now understand my son or my daughter or my uncle or my father better. Indigenous youth have really, really uh, gravitated to it because I told my truth in a way that didn't pull punches and respected people's intelligence. And they really, really connect with it. That's one of the largest demographics are Indigenous youth that are picking up the books. I was just on a call yesterday, and it was a half Indigenous youth, and they said, well, we have never read a book before from cover to cover because they're all so boring, and we picked yours up, and I love, this is my favorite book. And so that's the greatest compliment to me, and it's been embraced by the Indigenous community, which I find wonderful.
Was that one of the reasons that the chapters are so short? Was that intentional?
Yeah, it was actually. There was a technique that I used. I was Googling actually what makes a book readable on YouTube one day. And I came across this drunk old man named Charles Bukowski. And he was just ripped. And he was in this interview with this Belgian guy. And he's like, writers have gotten away from pace. It's all about pace and story. That's what drives a book. And people think it's about flourishing language and how sophisticated you are. It's actually the opposite. It's how fast the narrative rolls. And so I remember back to my time when I was reading and what kept me going. It's the reward of finishing a chapter. It's like a fish hook, right? And then once you get that in them, then you can just reel them in for the next one. And they just keep doing that over and over and over. And before they know it, they're finished half the book and they're like, oh my God, what's the next half of the book going to be like? And it's the exact same. So yeah, it was a technique.
I just want to talk about your writing process. Are you surprised that you're a storyteller, that's come out?
Yeah.
At that skill?
As an author, like I never saw myself as an author. I've had trouble with reading. I still have trouble with reading even as a professor. So it's something that I still struggle with. So yeah, I don't know where it comes from. I have no idea. I think my grandfather, Searle, was quite the storyteller. He used to tell me stuff like he coached the Maple Leafs when he was young, and it's all BS, right? But he was teaching me how to tell stories, right? And the more fantastic, the more wonderful, the more lost I got in them as a kid, right? And then the next phase of my life where I learned storytelling, I guess, would have been when I was a panhandler, when I had to catch people's attention and say things directly to them and then get their money. That's really hard to do, right? And you had nothing to lose. And so I'd go up to hundreds of people a day to collect money for my addictions, telling them different stories and whatnot. And so I learned the art of oral storytelling there. And then finally, when I went back to Saskatchewan in 2013, I started connecting with elders. And these are like the premier master storytellers that have impressed upon me their craft. And I could see by the way that they told their stories that it was almost like their canoe rides down the Saskatchewan River. You know, there's rhythm to the way that they tell them, and there's a beauty to it. And so I learned cadence and syntax from them. And so I combined all that, and out of that comes From the Ashes.
Your imagery, just talking about the Saskatchewan River, is beautiful. Would you consider yourself more of a poet? You did talk about poetry in the book when you were trying to woo Lucy. Would you consider yourself first a poet or a storyteller?
Lucy says I'm a poet. I see myself as I see myself as a panhandler. That's how I see myself. You guys all listened to my story and gave me $20, so I must be pretty good at it, right? No, but I guess they would say I'm a knowledge keeper now. I think that's more accurate because I don't just write literary or nonfiction. I write historical work too. I write academic articles, so I'm a knowledge keeper, I would say.
The images, I have to go back to your poetry because one really struck me, very personal, very raw, was Windigo. What were some of the difficult parts of your life that you had to write about?
Some of them, like basically everything before I was 33 was hard, right? So I guess the hardest ones, though, the ones that I know I can't fix and that really bother me and keep me up at night are the hearts that I broke along the way. And I'm not just talking about people I was in love with, right? Like there was one, I was, a young man, and I broke a girl's heart and I ran away like a coward, like young men do when they're afraid of love. They sabotage it and run away. So I did that. Looking back and seeing that I broke my brother Jerry's heart over and over, and like I can't fix that now. My grandparents too. That's what that poem amends about is at the back, where I actually drove up to their old house and I looked at, and I was like, I'm sorry, I said in my heart to them, and I can't get that back. And so those are the hardest parts to write about, and the early stuff with my father was really hard.
Mm-hmm. As this is National Addiction Awareness Week, I would like to ask you a question about that. What do you want your readers and other people to know about addiction and what it does to people?
One, I don't want people to think that it's a choice, right? Addiction is not a choice, right? It's a reaction to trauma, early childhood trauma more than likely, but like trauma. I've talked to Gabor Mate about my book, and he says that I really clearly draw that out. He's one of the experts in addiction and trauma in the world. And apart from that, I want people to know that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety. It's connection, right? It's human connection. It's building proper relationships with people and re-embedding yourself into the circle of relations. And so through that, I think homelessness can be solved. I think addiction can be solved. Mental health challenges can be solved. And that's what I would like, because the back end of my book really is showing you how I reconnected all those different relationships and rehomed myself and found connection and eventually found sobriety.
So when you had found your sobriety, did that really come from this reconnection with your identity? Throughout the entire book, identity seems to be a big theme, to the extent that you didn't want to be identified as First Nations, you'd rather be identified as Italian.
Yeah.
That theme of identity, idea of identity, did that help you through the healing process?
Oh, for sure. It was everything. Like I'd gone through treatment. I'd been an addict for 10 years, like a hardcore addict, often on the streets. And then by the time I got to rehab, I did their program, which was a 12-step program. And that only took me so far with my addiction and getting better. It wasn't until I got to university where I started to really say, I'm white knuckling it here in my first year. I need to get to the root of my addiction, and my addiction issues were the disconnection from my mom and my dad, and how my relationship to my Métis Cree ancestors was severed through adoption. And so I needed to go back and reconnect with my ancestors, look at my family history. And when I did that, all the stereotypes that I had heard about Métis and Cree and our people that I'd been digesting my whole life from public, institutions, that media that tell us what Indigenous peoples are. I saw that, hey, we're not those negative things. We're actually a really proud people that stood up for what we believed in, defended our land and the bison, and everything was taken from us. And it's not our fault that we have this dysfunction and trauma within our families. And so when I did that, I came to embrace my Métis-ness, and then I turned into super Métis. I started wearing fur everywhere. I started wearing sashes like crazy, walking around with a paddle. And my mom was like, "Whoa, cool it, man. That's how I know that you're not Métis. We don't dress like it's the 17th century anymore." And she's been teaching me actually what it is to be a Métis person in Saskatchewan. We love chicken balls. I know that every Métis person knows that. So I learned that from her.
Why do you think there was a difference with how long it took for you to kind of embrace your Indigenous identity and your brothers? Josh especially seemed to have connected very quickly and very strongly with his culture, to the extent that he even had in high school, he had a vision
Yes.
of you. Why do you think there was that difference?
I think because they were older, they remembered more of Saskatchewan than I did. My brothers were 4.5, 5.5 when we were taken from our mom.
Mhm.
I was only 3.5. In those formative years, like that's when memory and consciousness are forming. And so they were in it a little longer. So that's the only thing I can come up with. And probably they weren't cowards like I was. I wanted to fit in with all the cool kids. And you did that by denying who you were and acting a certain way. And they just didn't do that. They were more true to themselves. I respect them. A lot of people that read my book or know of me think it was me that brought the indigeneity to my family, back to it, but it was actually my brothers who are always anchored in their identity. And I feel sorry for the way I treated them growing up.
What's your relationship like now with them?
My one brother, Josh, we get along great. He's like my big brother, and I call him whenever I need help or I'm in crisis,
Mhm.
and he tries to help me. And my other brother, me and Jerry aren't talking right now. The pressures of the book and sibling rivalry. We're fighting. We're like the Gallagher brothers. You guys like the music band, the Oasis? You know Oasis? We're the native Oasis brothers, the Gallagher brothers. So we always fight, but we'll get back together again sometime. And Daniel, my little brother, calls me all the time, and he's really annoying. He calls me too much. He wants me to talk to him more than I talk to my wife, and that's like crazy. Like, yeah.
Do you think that your life would have been really different if you hadn't been taken away from your mom, or if your grandparents had raised you, like your Saskatchewan grandparents had raised you?
I think about that a lot. I don't know. Like where I'm from in the north there around PA, it's pretty
Mhm.
bad, eh? It's pretty bad. And there's a lot of crystal meth addiction and gangs. And all my cousins were part of that or are in prison or dead. My age, like I'm 45. And so I don't know. I don't know. It's to look back and say that I would have done better here in Saskatchewan as opposed to Brampton. I can't say. Can't say. Maybe I would have been more whole and in my culture, but maybe I would have went down a different road too. So it's yeah, I've often thought about that.
When was the last time you were back in Saskatchewan?
February. I saw my brother Daniel and he bugged me for 2 new pairs of shoes and I had to buy them. I swear, every time I see this man, he asks me for shoes. He's like Sex in the City, but the native guy version of it, but he's my little brother and he thinks I'm rich because I sold some books in Canada, right? You don't get rich selling books in Canada, I tell you that. So, but I like to pay for him because I'm his big brother and it makes me feel good. So, yeah.
At the beginning of the book, you dedicate your book to Indigenous children who were robbed of their Indigenous identity by being separated from their families, residential school, the 60s scoop. And you offer this book as a torch to light their way back to the family hearth. What has the responses been outside of the Indigenous community, just the addiction community?
Uh, Yeah, like experts in trauma, world experts in
Mm,
trauma, like Gabor Mate, Dr. Jody Carrington, other psychologists, people in the medical establishment, they all have really embraced the book because it lays bare the path into addiction as well as charts a footpath out of it, through reconnection. And I think that's what's unique about my book, because I don't say like it was a choice of mine or it's because of this and this. I show you the traumatic things that happen, and then I show you how I actually build those and how hard it was to come out of the addiction too. And so they've really embraced the book, and I know that they give it away to their friends and colleagues to help educate people on addictions. So
do you think that every child who is in care should read this book?
I do. I do. Yeah. Yeah. And I wrote that like that. And I'm glad that you brought that up, actually. I showed people what a scoop looks like from the inside, right?
Mm,
As a 3-year-old boy, I put you through my eyes and I make you feel what I was feeling. The discombobulation, the total disorientation that happens where you're in one spot in 1 minute, then you're in the next, and then you're in a completely different city and everything's supposed to be okay, right? What I didn't tell the reader though, and what I'll explain now that makes it a story of a scoop was like, why did they call my white grandparents? Why didn't they just call my Indigenous mom? Right? I couldn't write that because I was a 3-year-old boy and I didn't know that. So I think a lot of the people in the mainstream have missed that. People who are Indigenous, who have been scooped, they really get it. They get really triggered by that part of the book because I show you actually how it felt. And so, yeah, I'd like them to read it when they're a little older and they can handle, the information.
so as you know, I am from First Nations University Canada. I feel very lucky to be working in this institution. What role do you see education playing in this reconnecting with Indigenous identity?
I think it's central. But it's ironic too, right? Like these institutions are what stripped away our indigeneity for 150 years up until very recently. And now, I guess since like 2000 or 2010, they're the places that are re-indigenizing a lot of our youth, the disconnected youth. And so in this way, I guess we're stewards of cultural knowledge that have academic or institutional backing behind us to get the job done and help people reconnect. And so it's a great responsibility, like Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility, you know? And I really believe that. I really do.
Do you think that if you had stayed in Saskatchewan that you would have been able to hold on to that identity and would have attended an institution such as ours or another program maybe at the U of S that, looked at Indigenous identity?
Yeah, I could have. Yeah. If, like if I would have stayed with my mom, right. And we didn't get scooped and we didn't go through that system and weren't, abused the way we were, maybe I wouldn't have had early childhood trauma where from whence my addiction and um, not understanding myself grew. And maybe I would have at 17 or 18 graduated and gone to First Nations University or U of R. Not U of S though, don't U of R all the way. But I never know, right? I never know. I could have been like proud of who I was, my whole life, and maybe I had a different life altogether.
So you have had some very strong women in your life. Do you want to tell us a bit about how they affected how you were able to heal yourself?
Sure, yeah. My cookum Nancy from the road allowances around Erin Ferry up near Big River. She taught me about how to be a relative within our worldview, Wakuduin, helping each other through our law in a good way. And so I carried that with me my whole life. My grandmother Jackie loved me. She taught me about love, and she was broken herself. She had lost her own son to addictions in 1982, and so I always carried that broken love with me, and I came to understand her better after I sobered up and started making amends. And I saw that they really did love me. Like who takes in 3 kids that aren't their own? No one does that. She did that. you know, and so she taught me love through her actions. Then I met my wonderful wife, Lucy, who kind of took over in a lot of ways from the role that my grandmother, Jackie, played in my life. Um, like in terms of kicking my ass and making sure that I honor my word and I'm a good man, Lucy's there. Like it's a real love, you know. We love each other romantically, and I take her out to dinner and buy her lobster and all that good stuff. But she also will set me straight in the morning and make sure like I do what I'm supposed to be doing and I stand up like a man and provide. And so in knowing my role through these powerful women, that kind of in a lot of ways saved me, you know, saved me and made me into a stronger man where I came to embrace my roles, you know, and so I learned that from them, you know.
You also talk about your auntie Yvonne.
Yes, my Auntie Yvonne. She's the crazy genealogist. She loves Ancestry.com. I swear she's got a tattoo of it on her arm. Like she's hardcore. She was doing all of our family research, you know, all the way back to Batoche, all the way back to New France, everything, you know, the great chiefs of the Saskatchewan, Mistawasis, Atakakop, all of them. She had them all mapped out. And so by the time I was thirsting to find out who I was, she was there. She's the real knowledge keeper and historian in our family, you know? And so I plugged into that field of knowledge, and that led me to Elder Maria Campbell, my connections with people out on the prairies that I still have today, and the work that I do. And so, yeah, she's a real power to be reckoned with. And my mom too, you know. I took my mom on the road doing my research. She's my RA. She's like the camera operator and she runs like the voice recording equipment. But really, it's just like I get to spend government money and go on a road trip with my mom. And like people trust her, right? She's one of them. She's one of the Machif from the road allowances. So they'll talk to her and then talk to me. And so it's a beautiful relationship where I learned research methodologies from both of my aunt and my mom.
Is your mom still living in Saskatchewan here?
Yes, she is. She's in Saskatoon. She's she's off 11th Street, I believe. Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest challenge for Indigenous homeless youth?
I think there's a misunderstanding by the state and all the service providers, especially if they're Western. They don't understand the driving factors behind Indigenous homelessness. Like there's loss of land, disconnection from culture, loss of spirituality and worldview. There's just various types of drivers to Indigenous homelessness that are vastly different than settler homelessness. And it's not really just about not having a place to live, right? Which is what settlers think it is. That's the Western. I've articulated in the definition of Indigenous homelessness through community consultation that Indigenous homelessness is really about a disconnection from the relationship web of all my relations due to colonial interruption. So things like residential schools, scoop, purposeful destruction of our homes, our domiciles, destruction of our languages, all these have produced homelessness. And that's why it's out of control currently across our country for Indigenous people.
How do you think that we could de-traumatize the process of seeking housing for homeless youth?
How could we de-traumatize?
Mm-hmm.
I think if service providers, first we need to get the money to Indigenous service providers out in the field that are doing the work already. They're just understaffed. Once these institutions grow, then I think we need to connect youth on the ground with these type of institutions that understand the problem of Indigenous homelessness better than places like the Salvation Army or the Mission or, you know, faith-based organizations. We need to strip away any sort of faith-based, you know, thing because like for our people, there's a lot of negative connotations with, you know, Judeo-Christian worldviews and scripture and all that stuff. Even though in my book, they're one of the people that helped save me. You know, it's different for me because I didn't know about Indigenous service providers back then, you know, and so I think that would have helped my journey for sure if I had services available from an Indigenous service provider.
Do you think that if there were more Indigenous social workers, that this would help?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, sure. I think, and not trained as Western social workers either, using our own, ways to disseminate our knowledge to our people, I think is critical, and it's missing. I think we need to reform how those social workers interact in places like child welfare too.
Mhm.
I think instead of taking a child out of the situation, what we need to do is take the problem adult out of the situation. So if we look at my dad's in our situation, why didn't they just take my dad out of there and then call my mom and then give my mom housing and foster care support with money to take care of us? We had a completely different life, but instead they chose to take my dad out and then we were lost to the system. That makes no sense to me, you know?
There actually is a reserve in Manitoba that was trying that. So instead of taking the children out of the home, they would take the parent out of the home and give them counseling.
Yeah,
That
great
was
idea.
brilliant.
Yeah. Did it work?
You know what? I had contacted them to find out if it did work. And I didn't hear back from them, but I keep listening for it because I think that's so brilliant. Instead of, traumatizing the child by taking them out of the home, you're giving the parent, who obviously is the one who needs that counseling, you're giving them that counseling. So,
Exactly. That's good to hear.
so before we end our discussion today, I would really love to know, what are you reading right now?
What am I reading right now?
What are
Actually,
you reading right now, Jesse?
this is about Mi'kmaq history. It's
Mhm.
a story written by Benita Lawrence, who's in my department, but it's a fictionalized 300-year story from Membertou.
Mhm.
He's the chief that signed the Concordat with the Pope all the way up until today. And so it goes through all the different treaties, all like the fights out of New England and Massachusetts with Mi'kmaq people. And it's quite educating and quite profound. Great read.
Highly recommend.
Yeah. I highly recommend it for sure.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank
I'm
you.
told that was my last question. It has really been a real pleasure. And now I'm going to hand things over to Sarah because I think she has some questions for you from our chat.
All right.
Yes, thank you, Paula, so much for doing that. And Jesse, thank you so much for being open and honest with us. We so appreciate you and your time, of course. And so please, anybody that has any questions for Jesse, you can put in the chat, and I will grab as many as I can. So I'll just kick things off. I have a question. Why did you start the book with scripture?
The kingdom of heaven suffers violence and violent men take it by force, right? And that's the quote. One, I did it to kind of be like Pulp Fiction, there's the quote in that's kind of badass with Samuel Jackson, and there's a reason why he used that. I've listened to interviews, and there's something about that language that's so hard, that's beyond swearing, it's just like biblical, right? And so I used it in that effect. And also I had to commit a violent act to steal my bit of heaven, to steal my bit of normalcy, to secure the safety of my foot. And so I had to, the kingdom of heaven, which is what I'm living in now. I'm happy with my wife. Some violent men have to do violent things to get there. And I had to do what I had to do to get here. And that's what that actually means.
Great, thank you. Next one we have is from Brittany, and she's asking, when we meet people in the street who are facing tough times, what is the best way to show our support?
Talk to them, take time to talk to them, look them in the eye. They're community members, they're family members. They all have stories like I do, or worse or better. So there's that. If they ask you for money, give them money, why not? $5-10 is not going to hurt your life. And it's certainly not going to change theirs. And why wouldn't you want to help somebody out when they need it? And so I always give money. I don't ever ask what they're going to use it for. I don't care what they're going to use it for. York University, when they pay me, doesn't ask me, what are you going to do with this money, Jesse? Make sure that you pay your rent and all this. So why am I doing that to them? So yeah, that's what I would say. And then if you can, donate your time to like a local food bank or, shelter or, drop off some socks and stuff like that. So.
Thank you. This question comes from Catherine, and she's asking, how did you learn of the abuse of your brothers in the foster home? In the book, you speak of knowing about it when it happens, but you were very young at the time, and I doubt you would have any of that awareness. So how did you learn of that?
My brothers, they told me, right, what was actually happening there. And so Jerry told me, and Josh told me years later when he was an adult in his 30s, what had happened there. And so I know that Jerry's pursuing some sort of lawsuit on my brother. And that's where I got paperwork actually to confirm that we were in child services. It's a very brief entry, but I looked at it and I'm like, okay, I got to write about this. And so he's doing something with that. And because we're not talking, I haven't figured out or heard what he's doing.
Next question. When you speak of the second rehab, you explain that it was the turning point for your healing. This person is wondering, why did you not write about what you lived in the second rehab?
Why? Because you're not supposed to talk about your program. It's Alcoholics Anonymous, right? And so I couldn't go deep into my program basically because we're not supposed to talk about the other people that were in the program with me. So I wrote a little bit about it, but not enough to reveal what the program actually was.
Okay, great. This question comes from Elsa, and at the end of the book, you have a missing persons poster of your dad. Will you always keep looking for him?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that was one of my grandfather's dying wishes, to look and to keep looking. And so I think any person whose parent goes missing, they have kind of an obligation to look, because if we're not going to look for our family members, especially as Indigenous peoples, we certainly know that the police or the authorities or other people won't. And so I'll always keep looking. And that was part of the stipulation to write the book, was that to make sure that that missing persons report was at the back of the book, to show, like, I want people, I don't know how many people have bought in the book. Now each person has seen that. Each person is now looking with me,
Yeah, very much so. This question from Brooke, do you have any hopes of how your book will continue to literature in the future? Contribute, to literature in the future.
I don't understand the question. Can you say that again?
Yeah, do you have any hopes of how your book will contribute to literature in the future?
Yeah, it's voices from the marginalized, right? Like truly marginalized, like homeless and addicted. And so it's added to the contribution of those chorus of voices that have not been heard for years and years, right? And so in that way, it's added. Some people might not agree with the way that I told my story. Some people might agree with it. That's not, for me, it's a piece of art. It's out there now, but it is contributing to that larger discussion where people need to hear these voices and know these histories and stories.
This question from Stephanie. Do you feel you are a role model for young Indigenous men? And are there youth who have written and reached out to you for support or help?
I don't think I'm a role model, no. I'm just a guy who survived, It's like I survived a plane crash and I walked away from the wreckage. I don't think that really makes me a role model. Maybe someone to listen to that has wisdom, that knows, who's been there. I could claim that. And there are youth that reach out to me, dozens every week, all the time, trying to figure out themselves, their path, struggling through addictions, through homelessness, some of them, and trying to understand their own family members that are dealing with these issues. And so, yeah, I'm trying to dance around that question. I don't really know how to answer it. So that's the best I can come up with. But they do contact me all the time, yeah.
I would assume you are very much a role model for many people that have picked up this book. So this question from Simone, first a comment, wants to thank you for your courage and continually moving forward on your journey and sharing it. How does your PhD in history connect with your journey? And from your story, it sounds like another field like social work might be appealing too.
Well, I was one of the first people to articulate Métis historic intergenerational trauma from the Battle of Batoche or the 1885 resistance, and like trace it through time, through the road allowances to contemporary times, to Métis of my generation. And so it has everything to do with my healing path, my continued healing path, as well as to me disseminating our narrative from our point of view, right? Because part of trauma, historical trauma, is that it severs people from their ancestors and their connection to their past. And so that's really the more important work than my book. My book is just secondary to my work in history as well as homelessness, you know. It's just gotten all this press and stuff. But like, to me, the more important work is the historical work around road allowances, for sure.
Okay. This question from Georgina, saying she absolutely loved your book. And do you plan on writing another one? And if so, can you tell us about it at all?
Yeah, I do. I do plan on writing another book. My Uncle Ron's story is, he was a professional bank robber in the 70s and 80s, and his story is really a reaction to colonial trauma. And it's going to be an advocacy piece for Indigenous men that are in prisons. I believe wrongfully they're suffering from, you know, the way the state took our land, our cultures, and our worldviews from us. And the reaction from some of our men are to become, you know, hyper criminal, because there's a sense of agency in that too, right? They take, you know, they've had so much taken from them that they in turn internalize that and take. And so I want to write that about him, because in my family, he was like a legend, you know, that we always heard stories about. And it wasn't until later that I really heard his full story and I started to really sympathize and say, you know, I'm going to write a fictionalized version of that. And so that's my next book. It's not going to be 100% based on his life, but fictionalized through that. And it will stand as an advocacy piece.
Okay. With regards to this book, what's next? I have heard that it's being turned into an HBO show potentially.
Yeah. How did you hear that? A little mouse told you, you know? Yeah, I can talk about that here, I guess. Inside scoop, inside scoop. We're signing. We're doing a mini series, 4-part mini series. We're going American because it's going to be a lot bigger. Based on the success of From the Ashes, we've decided to go south of the border, and we're securing writers, and the production team is on point. But I don't know if anybody's familiar with this like stage of what's called optioning. It can get lost in the option. So things can get stalled because there's so much money involved, especially in the States. Like here in Canada, you can just go and apply for what's like CanCon money, and they'll give you money because you're Indigenous, basically, and then you can make your thing because they want Indigenous content. Where in the States is different. You have to be competitive. And so we're taking a big gamble. You know, it could hit and could go big, really big, or it could like not happen at all. And then we might seek the Canadian route later. So
Great. So there is a theme in the book of this crushing hunger, both literal and metaphorical. And I know when I was reading the book, and the story that I tell people when I'm talking to them about the book is you and your brother sitting in the kitchen, chipping away at a turnip and picking the pieces up and eating them because you guys were so hungry. So is there anything you want the readers to understand about that driving force of hunger?
yeah, that's one of the most harmful things that happened to me that I'm still dealing with today, actually. So that gnawing hunger that came from being with my dad and not having anything, that continued through my whole childhood, right? And I always like, we destroyed every like platter of for whatever family thing my grandparents took us to. And then same kind of trauma was happening when I was on the streets. I just couldn't feed myself properly, right? Because of just, that's the life. And, you know, it wasn't until I got out of treatment, and I was in my like 3rd year of university where my my trauma from food started to abate a little, but I was already like way, way big, right? Because I just kept eating and eating because I had food finally for the first time in my life. I ate like a bag of chips, a big chocolate bar every night, and I made myself the best food, trust me. But like I got big, and so I had to work the other way. I had to work like with a psychologist, say, it's okay, Jesse. You don't have to eat the whole fridge, you know? You can eat just like a salad and have some chicken breast and then go for a nice long walk. And so I've done that during COVID times with Lucy, and I've replaced that compulsion to eat that comes from trauma with exercise. And I feel good for the first time in many, many years. But like it's taken a long time, my whole life, to get that under control.
Good for you. Congratulations. Speaking of COVID, do you have any thoughts about the current COVID-19 pandemic and the effects it has on Indigenous people and the homeless, and how we might provide support or educate ourselves during this time?
I've been asked to sit on as an executive on some of the COVID hotels in Toronto, but I refuse that, right? The world is different than when I was homeless. And so I would say pressure your governments if they're leaving people exposed in shelters where there's really high density. Pressure your local governments to start sequestering hotels, because we're in the second wave now. Like we had to do that really fast here in Toronto during the first one, and Hamilton, and I think we need to do that again now. And so that would be my thing. Call and pressure your local MPs or whoever is in charge of that, your mayors, to sequester hotels to start taking care of people and spacing them out more.
Good information to have. As Saskatchewan people learn treaty history, where do we turn to understand Métis contributions and or marginalization? And that question comes from Sheena.
Well, Treaty 6 is a great way to look at that. Mr. Wassis himself was known as his real name's Pierre Bélanger. He was a half-breed, quote unquote, historical. And so the construct of Métis and First Nations, especially in northern Saskatchewan, I think is a product of more the Indian Act, right? That separated all of our different clans apart. And now we have this modern conception where we're different people than them, where if you look at it from like a kin-based understanding, it's a more complete understanding of who we are as people, because in our families, we have Cree, we have Soto, we have Métis, we have white guy, we have a Czech person, and that's really more accurate of understanding who we are. And so I would look to the work of Rob Innes. He does really great work in a book called Older Brother in the Law that articulates this phenomenon on looking at our people through the way maybe our ancestors would have understand themselves, through this kin-based understanding, through our worldviews.
Great, and I think we have time for probably one more question here. So this question comes from Isla. She says, in the book, you discuss your father's Indigenous heritage through his mother. Did he have much knowledge or connection with his heritage? And if not, do you think a greater connection with his heritage would have been helpful to him with his own addiction issues as it has been for you?
Yeah, I think it would have. I think my grandmother, Jackie, denied her Algonquin heritage because her father, David Mackenzie Jr., had gone to Spanish residential school. He was part Algonquin. And so that was a really shameful thing for her. But that trauma still resonated through her that came from her father and echoed down through her and then went to my father. And so I think that would have greatly helped my father, maybe would have helped him get better, to understand that he's not competing with his own personal traumas. He's dealing with what had been handed to him from his ancestors. And so, yeah, surely I think he would have, changed and, maybe be here with us, and I wouldn't have to put out this book or missing persons report.
Okay, and I'm just going to ask you one quick question to wrap things up, Jesse. Would you ever consider moving back to Saskatchewan? And I don't know if I could go as far to say, come work with us at the university?
Yeah. If the money's right and I can find a nice place to shack up with Lucy, we're good.
Sounds good. Okay, well, we're going to hold you to that. So,
yeah.
Jesse, thank you so much. Your book was incredibly eye-opening, inspiring, and I know I took more lessons from it that I could ever count. So thank you so much for letting us into your world a little bit. I know we will all anxiously be awaiting book number 2 and this potential HBO series that we promised to never speak of until it gets announced.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Jesse.
Thank you so much.
And Paula, thank you so much for your time as well. We really appreciate having you with us today. It was great to connect.
Totally my pleasure. Absolutely. Jesse, such a pleasure to chat with you today. You're amazing.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Paul. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
All right, everyone, thank you so much. We are going to wrap things up with just one more poll question. So if you would please answer, would you like to see more of these live book club events in the future? Just a quick yes or no. I'll give you a second here to select one. If it's anything like today, I have a feeling it's a yes. So you can register for our online book club and join us in our next book called Without You, There Is No Us by Suki Kim. She has written a memoir of teaching English to the sons of North Korea's ruling class during the last 6 months of Kim Jong-il's reign, and it's a really haunting story of hers. She is actually one of our virtual speakers at the 2021 Inspiring Leadership Forum virtual edition on March the 3rd. So we want you all to pick up that book and also register and join us for that event, and connect with us on social media. We would love to hear from you, hear what you're up to, what you'd like to see from our alumni team. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today. Again, a very special thank you to Jesse for joining us all the way from Hamilton. We hope everybody stays safe during COVID and stay home so we can enjoy Christmas with our families, hopefully. Bye, everyone.